Together Talks podcast today, very exciting because we've got Carl Heneghan with us. Carl, thank you so much for joining today.
You're welcome.
Carl, you're an expert in evidence-based medicine at Oxford. Some people will know what that means, but just what is evidence-based medicine, just to begin with?
Yeah, well, the first thing is to say I work in healthcare and I'm an urgent care general practitioner and I work at the University of Oxford in research. And I have this interest in how we use evidence in terms of making decisions. And there are three issues when you think about evidence-based medicine. It's having the best available evidence to make decisions, integrated with clinical experience and expertise, and then your values. What are your values? Because you can present two people with the same bits of evidence and they can come to very different decisions about what to do next. And that's incredibly important because that's called shared decision making. It means informing the decisions. So we try and look at the quality of the evidence, try and get that best available research evidence in front of people. But there are many problems with that evidence base that we look into and try and improve the methods of how we go about that.
Well, you've hit on a really strong point because values and evidence, because sometimes people, and they've done this before COVID, obviously, they say the evidence says that.
Yeah.
And what they mean is they say there's some evidence and then we want you to behave or in a certain way or have certain policy outcomes. Well, what you're saying is that there can be evidence and there can be research like in science, and then people, values or politics, you can make decisions about what you do about that evidence. Is that right?
Yeah, correct. And if you think about it, many issues in healthcare are about prevention. So you might be trying to prevent something in the medium to long term. And so you can put a decision to people, for instance, like you may have high blood pressure. And one person, I give them the same bit of information and they look at it and go, well, my dad died of a stroke. I'll take any measure to reduce my risk. But other people might look at it and say, well, I have different values. I don't want to take medicines. I want to try alternative approaches. And both are valid. The key is understanding this idea that decisions are informed. And a key concept is consent. For consent to be valid, you have to be informed about all the benefits and harms of a treatment. And that's incredibly important to understand because the idea when you override consent, mandate things, actually that goes against most of the principles that allow you to be an individual, have rights, and make choices about your own healthcare.
So quite a lot of people would agree with you on mandating things and on things like having a vaccine passport or a vaccine mandate. And they say, well, that maybe is a bridge too far. But then there's a question about informed consent. Now, there are all sorts of things that most people who are not in medicine, and even some people who are in medicine, don't understand or know about. But your point is that when you have something explained to you, you can know what the potential downsides are. Like my uncle's got a very serious autoimmune condition and he shows me the medication. He says, no one in their right mind would take this unless they've got what I've got. Yeah. And I make a choice that even though these are the outcomes that could happen, they could damage my liver, my kidney. The benefit to me of taking it versus if I don't, I'm going to die, right? So I could have these things happen as well. But then he makes a conscious decision. Is that what you're saying, that people have all the, because there is a question about what's happened in the last couple of years and also asking those questions about what's coming out, for instance, with the procedure, the vaccine and stuff like that.
So let's be clear. The first thing is let's talk about the mandate idea. There are things we do mandate for in terms of public health interventions. Most of them are about removing exposures in society, like we don't let people smoke in pubs anymore or restaurants. We're removing an exposure that causes you harm, and the evidence is very clear that that causes harm. There are a couple of occasions when we do intervene. Seatbelts is a good one example, but actually it's very clear evidence base that wearing a seatbelt reduces your risk and your passenger's risk and actually does you no harm. So you need a very strong, clear evidence base. However, most interventions and ideas of preventing in healthcare only apply to certain people, and there are known benefits and known harms. And when you balance those two up, your job is to make an informed decision. And this is the difference, you see. When you're actually a practitioner in healthcare, my job as a GP is to sit here with the best available evidence and try and present that so we can make an informed decision. There are a few occasions when that might not be the case. For instance, in the next minute or two, you've had a cardiac arrest and you're going to die, and I'm going to intervene because you're unconscious on the floor. So when we're very acute situations, it changes. But most is about a prevention. And often, sometimes the harms can outweigh the benefits. And what your uncle is saying there is that outside of my condition, these treatments, the harms would be greater than the benefits. Therefore, being informed allows you to make a decision about what to do next. Mandates, as applied in this current COVID pandemic, have gone against informed decision making.
Let's just take it to the start, because you're, as you say, you do practice. So it's not that you're just an academic, not that an academic is just, but that you're active in the field and what you do, and also you're thinking about things at the level of theory, but also practice and the interface. When did you, just tell us, firstly, what do you think was the real problem in terms of how the response to what happened and the way the government dealt with things? Do you think that their original approach would have been better for them to have taken a different route? Like, we saw them start in a certain way and then do something different, do a U-turn. Just what's your take on it from a medical point of view?
So I think there are some key issues that led to a tipping point of going into restrictions. The first is to say there was very little preparation. So simple things like not having any personal protective equipment, irrespective of whether you think it works later on, in the face of an unknown pathogen, you'd think you'd be prepared. So going into March that year, there was a realisation that there was a complete lack of personal protective equipment. There was also issues with not being able to have an effective test and trace system, irrespective of what you think later on, but it was disbanded very rapidly as soon as COVID became a notified disease. So what happened then is we deferred to modelling, and modelling came out with these doomsday scenario. There's going to be 500,000 deaths. So in the face of that, politicians literally had to panic and couldn't be seen to be doing nothing. This is the important issue about policy. And I learnt this in the swine flu pandemic. It didn't matter whether the policy was based on evidence or not. What really matters is we enact the policy. So we're seen to be doing something. Yeah. And that's a critical issue for politicians. And we, the public, can't tolerate inaction. But however, as a medical person, in the face of sometimes uncertainty, what you do is you learn to step back a bit and become more analytical and look at the data. And if you did that, the key element of the data that became very apparent very quickly was the age structure of who was affected. Within weeks, you could see that actually 75% of the deaths were in over 75-year-olds. And actually here in the younger age group, that they were relatively unaffected. And this is an important point, because in pandemic theory, what it says is the effect of the disease goes across all of the age groups. And that young people, like in the original Spanish flu in the 1918, actually what you saw is huge numbers of young people who died in that. But actually this was the exact opposite. So it was more like a seasonal effect. So you could have very rapidly started to change tack and go, let's actually go more to protect those at the very aging and not actually try and lock down and restrict people and see all of the potential collateral harms that were to follow.
Well, there's two things about that. Firstly, why did they not do that? But secondly, we did have a pandemic strategy that was jettisoned and thrown away. And people use the term unprecedented a lot, but lockdowns were I think maybe they did one experiment in Mexico and it was a Chinese thing and it was entirely new. So why did they not tweak and change tack? And we did have a pandemic strategy before. Why was that just jettisoned?
I mean, this is a very difficult question to answer because I look at, and there are still people I think are in this mode of thinking now that we should be wearing masks, restricting societies. Seems to me that the fear agenda was very heightened. And a combination of fear, lack of experience, and inability to tolerate uncertainty, put that together, it means you generally panic, don't you? And when you panic and you're stressed, you tend to make very quick decisions and actually, in the light of day, you wish you'd done something different. The problem in making them decisions at a political level is you're going to probably spend the rest of your life justifying those decisions because very few people want to say we got things wrong. Now, over time, this is, I think, an interesting point, is everybody's been on a journey where suddenly they went, maybe I'm not as fearful as I was. Maybe I'm looking at the evidence in a much more critical way, and there's much more uncertainty, and I don't quite understand why some of these policies are enacted when actually we as individuals are very good at judging risk. So this is the key element. Can you trust individuals in society to make judgments about their own risk? Or do you have to bring in legislation like the Coronavirus Act to actually tell people what to do? It's a bit like we were in primary school. We didn't know how to line up. Therefore, we have to have some rules and laws to make you all line up and do as you're told. Now, there was a very good control group that allowed us to look at that, which was Sweden, who said basically they did change their behaviour. We're very good at changing our behaviour in face of risk. We understand how to do that. But actually, somehow in this pandemic, the fear factor said we can't trust you as individuals, as a society, to make your own judgments.
So I want to, because you've been involved in all sorts of things, you have been in at Sage, you've been in different places where people have referred to you, asked you questions, and you've talked to widely. Maybe they didn't run with models, they ran with different models and things like that. But you've been at the coalface in many ways, in different ways. That we must be seen to do something, or doing nothing is not an option. This is where the thing I think is really interesting and goes to the nub of it, because some people say this is all part of a plan, right? It's all meant, this is done. But actually, this reflects some weakness in leadership. Because if you were really strong, and if you were clear about principles, and you said that actually we're not going to panic, we're not going to get, no matter how much you shout and scream in one quarter on social media or whatever, but actually this is the correct mechanism, this is the correct approach, and we need to be calm and carry on. And you could say that to protect vulnerable groups or whatever but that actually it isn't doing nothing. That's an active relationship to the situation, right? And that actually, even the idea that you're doing nothing, I mean, you've used the example of Sweden, that you're doing some other things, that's great. But even taking measures, that thing that's happened, I think that's been coming down the pipeline for the last 2 or 3 decades. It's almost like that's a politics issue, right? That there's a lack of leadership and strength and clarity. Well, what do you think about that?
My gosh, you've got a lot of points there, haven't you, Alan? So look, first, just to correct someone, I never was on Sage, but I have been in the Cabinet Office, and I've seen some of the advice and spent a lot of time informing politicians. So this is the key issue. There's a difference between trying to inform the decision and make the decision. So my fundamental approach is to try and help people make a better decision. Whereas if you go, my job is to make the decision, then what happens is you make a decision and you retrofit evidence to try and suit your position. And then you take one side or the other. Well, that's actually politics, isn't it? There's no politics if we don't have opposing views. But this is key. In informing the decision, what type of evidence would you want and how will you put that into the mix? Now, what happened throughout 2020 is most people were sat there going, we're going to have a zero COVID approach. What we're going to do is take a virus, first ever time we've ever seen it, and just like the bath, we're going to switch it off. We're going to turn the tap off, and then we'll just let it drain out. We'll have a bit of test and trace, and by November 2020, we'll all be back to the office. And by the way, wear a few masks, because that's going to have a massive reduction in risk. Basically, within 4 to 6 weeks, we'll be back to normal. What that approach does fundamentally goes against science and all of the theoretical epidemiology and the data that exists about how viruses spread and transmit. And as you've seen with the China approach, if you want to go down that zero COVID, you have, what's your end game? Because at some point, China has to have an end game to all this. And it will be decided probably by the economics. But the first thing is to say it has to be brutal, that lockdown. It's not actually, well, have primary schools open and shops open. It has to be brutal. And that's what you've seen in China. So I think that led to a problem for that whole year. That meant we weren't preparing. We weren't thinking about simple issues like, I look at the data and say, what proportion of hospital beds do we need extra to account for the flexibility of viral pathogens in the middle of winter? Well, it's about 20%, 20,000 extra beds. How are you going to resource that? How are you going to think about how we're going to get prepared? Well, the problem is we still haven't thought that through. So we're still hostage to the capacity problem. We sit in the UK with one of the lowest bed numbers per head of population in Europe.
Yeah.
And therefore, even this winter, we're going to run into the same problem. And what's going to happen is they're going to tell you there's a simple solution, have restrictions, wear masks, and that'll solve the NHS capacity problem. Well, that's utter nonsense. And this is the problem, you see. The short-termist quick fix, the silver bullet, is actually not fundamentally solving the problems. And if you understand these basic principles, the job is you're either in decision-making or you're in informing decisions. In informing decisions, people often, and this has been the interesting thing for me, when you bring an evidence-based approach, they often don't like it and they find it very difficult to contend with, because you're basically saying, here's the high quality evidence, here's the data, we're looking at it, here's what we think it means. And you've got a very strong opinion. You're going, oh, this is going against it. How do I rail against that? What they tend to do then is not go after the message or the evidence. They tend to go after you as an individual and try and say, let's put you in the corner, paint you as a sort of outlier, and therefore we can carry on with our very strong opinions.
So I want to come back to that point, which is crucial. But on the question of beds and resource, you've spoken about this quite widely, and if you look at examples like Germany, they have more individual rooms, for instance, than we have here, and you can do all of that. But we had this moment with the Nightingales, didn't we? And you think, right, well, you had the Nightingale approach, and then very few of them were taken up, but then they were decommissioned. And now we've got a situation where I think at the summer right now, we've got the same sort of capacity they had pre-lockdown. And you can see what you're talking about coming down the pipeline, because every year for the last 15, they've said NHS crisis, particularly the last 2 years. From your point of view, how's the best way to, because we at Together, we've often thought it's the public getting involved, tell MPs, put pressure on people. It's a political action, right? To say restrictions are not acceptable, you need to solve your problems. From the point of view of lobbying in your conversations with government and others, do you see are there any other ways that we can get that message? Because it's the more difficult thing, rather than saying go wear masks.
Yeah.
But that thing about sort out the resource, plan now, do something that's going to have real consequences ongoing, meaningfully.
Yeah, so I mean, the Nightingales is a beautiful example. About £600 million thrown down the drain. Looked good on TV. Here we are. We've got these amazing capacity. But actually, we've not been thinking it through. So we haven't got the hospital staff. We haven't got the doctors. And actually, what happened is completely unused. That's why you put 600 million down the drain. In fact, even in this third wave, they were still considering Nightingale hospitals and not thinking through the structural problem. How do we fix what's going on underneath? So what you need to do is be flexible in your approach. So you're right, in Germany they have much more greater beds, they have more community hospitals, and actually have the more isolation rooms. So you can actually have fever hospitals. So what's happening here in society is that actually sometimes the answers are in the past. Because we used to have fever hospitals. Those that are old enough, and you probably are, could remember the hospital that was on a single floor. In Manchester, it was Monsell Hospital, and that's where people with smallpox and all of these diseases used to go to isolate so they wouldn't infect everybody else. We spent the last 20 years thinking that actually what's happened is pandemics, viruses are over, because we've had a predominant narrative around influenza, and because we've got vaccines, we don't need to prepare. We can overcome it. The problem is pandemics will come in the future and keep coming.
Right.
That's first to say. When you understand that, you have to say, how can we be flexible in our approach? So there are two things you need. You need the capacity in the beds, so you need more community-based, but you don't need to have them open all the time. Doesn't mean much to have a mothball for the middle of summer. But you also need a flexible workforce. So I think you've got to think differently. The way I thought about the flexible workforce is why not have a sort of NHS reserve army? And in fact, that's what they tried to do. You have all these people who retire early or may go and do different things, but they can be flexible in their work. They could go from surgery to medicine for 4 weeks. But then also, when you retire, you could get 30 days a year. That's what the army does. There's about 30,000 reservists at any one point. So you think flexibly about your staff. Now, if you start to put that together, yes, it will cost you money. Well, the cost of shutting down the whole country for many months will be insignificant compared to what it will cost you. So you have an approach and you think about that and say, how do we consider? The problem is what happens is in the next 4 to 5 years, institutional knowledge will disappear. People will think it was in the past and this is now. And what happens is, just like the PPE, it gets sold off and you say, we don't need it, when actually you did need it. They're ready for action when the pandemic hit.
Well, we're just nearly halfway through, and you've already convinced me that you should be in the cabinet, or at least advising them strongly on what to do with a national strategy for health and to deal with provisions, because it seems to me it's eminently rational and sensible. And what you say about legacy of thinking and old ideas, I counted this in licensing as it happens, where you've got some brilliant people in licensing, brilliant police officers, counsellors, and then you had really terrible people, or people who were just new and didn't know anything. And you had to re-educate about some things that had basically been forgotten from the past. And then there's all these new policy ideas that come in that demonise the public. And actually demonising the public and how people were treated, I see an analogy that's kind of reflected. But I suppose my question to you is, how much do you think people are going to be prepared to... We've got like a leadership contest going on at the moment. To what extent do you think that things will continue to fall on deaf ears? Or that your experiences and what you've seen and the fact that now there are conversations going on in different parts of the media and elsewhere. There's a COVID inquiry. Who knows what's going to happen? It's a few years down the road. But how much of an impact do you think can be had in terms of steering the direction, the flow of movement?
So I think it's going to be difficult because I think there are commercial and competing interests in this sort of the world we now live in, with forces coming from outside to keep things going. So just let's say personal protection equipment or masks. There are people who have commercial and competing interests who want that to keep going. It's a big business. Same as the testing business. Think of the 37 billion we spent on test and trace, 50% more than the general practice budget. The key for me is when you make these decisions, surely you should have a rational debate about the opportunity costs. What are you forgoing when you put all of that money in? What could you do with that money in a different way? Now, I think the problem in current politics is we've had a massive shift in our dynamics. There are two important things that are different about this pandemic: PCR testing and the social media approach. And it's a very powerful force for certain groups of people to be very noisy and have their opinions out there. That's why I think it's incredibly important. People like yourself saying, look, our job is to have a voice. And in having a voice, this is really interesting to me. When I think about evidence-based medicine, when members of the public, and I've had huge members of the public come to me over time, point out what I call common sense issues, there's generally an important signal in there. So when you're asking questions like, should we close pubs at 10? Is that rational? Does the virus go to sleep after 10? Is that appropriate? Or actually, should you have a rule of 6 so you can see 6 people at 10 and a different 6 at 11 o'clock? But if you all meet together, that's an approach. And what I found is over time is people have looked back. I've talked to school teachers who say, we were inundated with rules. The playground with the boxes in where children couldn't mix. And they're now looking back and going, actually, these approaches were insane. Yeah. But actually, as soon as you get members of the public going, we're actually looking common sense, what's going on, then you've probably got a problem. And the problem is you've got an evidence void. So this is an important point. When you have different opinions, it often shows you've got missing evidence. And that missing evidence is the missing high-quality evidence. So you could have asked questions about public houses. We could have randomised some pubs to 10 o'clock and some to 11 o'clock in clusters in different areas and said, what difference does it make to the case rates in those areas? The problem is when you did that, you probably find out it made no difference. Because actually, the impact of what's happening is you've got all those people who are younger people who are mixing, who are already generating their natural immunity because they've been out and about. And you've got all these people at home who are scared on their computers these times saying, please don't go out and about because actually I want to be protected. So it's okay to have all these people like my bin men, all the delivery drivers, all the shop assistants putting themselves at risk. But if I'm sat behind my computer, I can send a message out, please keep this going. So this rational approach is key. When you see different opinions, you need to develop an evidence base. And until you do that, we'll continue to argue about what to do next. And I think what's happening, for instance, in terms of the publican houses and what happened there, was one of the most irrational policy bases I've ever seen. And what we'll see into the future is hopefully people keep reminding us and talking about how irrational they were and how it just goes, we're following the science. No, we weren't. We weren't following the science. We weren't following the evidence. We were following people who had opinionated views, probably based on very high fear levels.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, I don't know if you can follow the science because it's research and it's, as you say, there's some evidence to things, but then what we choose to do about it, you don't follow things, right? You have to put them into practice. You've had an enormous influence, right? I mean, I don't want to understate it on certain. I mean, when we did the protests against the mandates and against vaccine passports on Parliament Square, we had Sir Graham Brady come out and Steve Baker and others. And Steve Baker name-checked you and cited examples of your work that had put forward an alternative view about not panicking and dealing with things sort of objectively. Now, people might say, well, Steve Baker and Graham Brady, they're a very particular group within, the Tory party. But I wonder to what extent, how do you see things now? Because you talked about sort of name calling and demonization, which we'll talk a bit more about. How do you see things as a snapshot now, what we've just experienced over a couple of years and where we're going? How do you see things in terms of how much people are listening and responding in terms of the government and others, and also the public?
Well, let me take 2 points. Let me just take the thinking behind mandates. Okay. The thing about mandates is that we can't inform you about the benefits and harm, and you can't come to a value judgment about the treatment. And in doing so, you're a threat somehow, a public health threat, if you don't take the vaccine. So that would also mean that the vaccine not only protects you, it protects others. Well, the evidence was quite clear very early on that it doesn't protect others, it doesn't stop transmission. The second issue is we said, well, actually, how many interventions have an evidence base for improving the uptake of vaccines? Well, we've done a systematic overview of all the reviews that have looked at this, and there are 49 different interventions. Most of them are about informing and educating you. But actually, mandates is a policy that you can just go like that, and it's really simple, have a vote, job done. And you can pick certain sectors like care homes. And then you can go, not think about, again, the opportunity cost. How many people will leave the care sector because they've looked at the benefit-harm profile and thought, I want to make an informed judgment, and actually, you don't pay me enough. And if you go into care homes, and I go into care homes throughout the pandemic, as an urgent care doctor, it's an incredible sort of moment to go into a care home where they've got COVID, going back to May 2020, when, this is the bubonic plague, and you've got these staff in the middle of these care homes on about £9-10 an hour, who basically are putting their lives on the line, and then a year later you're saying, well, you're out of a job. I find that, just not just deeply problematic, I find that ethically and morally a problem, and I think that has to be challenged in our thinking. Now, I think you mentioned some names of people who I think there's been about 100 MPs who've come forward and said, we want to think differently. We want to be critical. We want to look at the evidence, and we want to think about what's in the best interest of all society.
Yeah.
The big problem, I think, and is that the opposition in this has been on the opposite side of lockdown. And I can't explain that because I have had relationships with many people across the Liberal Democrats and the Labour in areas like transvaginal mesh, where we worked on hormone pregnancy tests. I've been on all parliamentary groups. Yeah. Very thoughtful and critical about the evidence. But in this current pandemic, the problem is the opposition has been almost further to the left, or I don't know, right, or whichever way you want to look at, to lockdowns. Not a single person has come forward in the opposing parties and said, do you know what, I want to represent the bin men. I want to represent all those people in care homes. I do not think mandates are a good idea, and here's why. Because you're targeting a very vulnerable sector of people who really matter in all this. So I think what happens here is the parties have been too political, trying to take opposing views, and not been critical and thoughtful enough. So this is a cross-party issue for me. To solve this going forward, it needs a much more thoughtful and critical approach from all MPs, because otherwise we may get people just going taking a particular position because it's an opposing view.
We've seen a lot of that. I mean, in America, you can't have a conversation without it being subject to the culture war. So if you try and talk about masks in New York or in Florida, the reaction and response will be based on the alternative. So are you like Mr. Trump, or whatever it is. And it's impossible to almost now to have a conversation without that being the case. I think in here as well, because one of the things about the nudge unit and about fear, but also the idea that we're looking after everyone, that was a very strong idea that I think a lot of people stoically said, look, I'm going to do my bit. And we saw 1 million people volunteer to begin with, which was great. But then it sort of morphed into this, I'm going to look after people. And the opposition always seemed to go further. And perhaps the media were often crying to go further as well. But in the oppositional politics, I think the idea was that it was about protecting people. That argument had been convinced. And some people, like with the 100 that you said, there were some that challenged the mandates and there were some that didn't like the vaccine passports. But this idea that it was really protecting people was a very strong one, wasn't it? And to what extent can we say now that actually it was detrimental? I mean, if you look at, what the Great Barrington Declaration said, focus protection, and then not shutting the rest of society down, and all the other harms you said as cost-benefit analysis, if we could look at all the impacts, family, education, mental health, jobs, the cost of living, all of those things, do you think some of them would change their mind about it now? They backpedal and not do it again?
I think remember the slogan, protect the NHS? I think in time we'll look back at that slogan as one of the worst decisions and policy sort of marketing statements ever that's been enacted. And I don't say that lightly. I mean, there are so many ways that was detrimental to people's health. The first is we decided to empty hospitals. And what we did is we took people out of hospitals in March 2020, many of the elderly and vulnerable, irrespective if they were COVID positive, we put them in care homes. They went into care homes with no personal protective equipment, no isolation rooms, and very low staff numbers. What happened next, everybody knows. It's just a disaster policy. But also importantly, and this is in my role as an urgent care physician, is it stopped people presenting to the healthcare with non-COVID problems. So people could have chest pain, they could have left arm weakness, all sorts of issues that normally you present, you'd ring 999, you want to go in hospital. But at this moment in time, you're going, not only am I protecting the NHS is a very scary place to go. And therefore I'm going to stay away. So what we saw is record reductions in all of those emergency presentations. Then we've seen a reduction in preventive care, which is evidence-based, all of the blood pressure checks, all of the diabetes checks. And now we're playing catch-up, yet we've got over 6 million people on the waiting list. So basically, you had this nice slogan, protect the NHS, let's all clap for the NHS, but it was a disaster. And at the time, trying to point that out was very difficult because in the midst of all the frenzy and the fear, you were seen as threatening the public health message. But now as we look back and start to unpick this, the inquiry will not be the bit that will unpick all this. It will be history that will look back in time because people will continue to analyse this and go, what a mistake that was. The question is, can we repeat it? I think we can. Because the problem is we failed to learn from history many times. And it's almost like you have to have something catastrophic that's very visual for people to really change the way we do things. And the best example of that is thalidomide. The drug thalidomide was given out in the absence of clinical trials. And it was given to, what it was shown to do when you did that, it reduced the risk of vomiting. Where can we find a population who have a lot of sickness and vomiting? Actually, pregnant women. We've got the perfect treatment in the first trimester. And then what happened is you got this huge problem, which was very visual, the phocomelia, which showed children with missing arms and limbs. That led to the establishment of drug regulation that required clinical trials, high-quality evidence to underpin drugs. We've learned from that. And you see in this current pandemic, trials like the recovery, large-scale randomized controlled trials were done. Somehow, we feel differently about non-drug interventions. Somehow I can have the right idea. But when you decide to intervene, you can equally create harm compared to benefit. It's called equipoise. And therefore, if you understand that, you basically know you need to develop an evidence base whenever you decide to do something that potentially has effects both ways.
Can I ask then, just on that, so do you think, from your point of view, the trial-based examples for the COVID jab did that? It met the criteria that was outlined, subject to what happened from thalidomide onwards, the need to do that?
So there are two important aspects, big biases that come with clinical trials. One is called publication bias. That means some of the results are not published when they're available. So the trial doesn't appear because it may be a negative. The second is reporting bias. And that means you may produce some of the results, some of the positive results, and you may not publish some of the harmful results. But what happens is when you have an intervention and you don't address those two fundamental issues, you introduce uncertainty into the debate. And what's happened in the debate is, yes, now I'm part of the action trying to get what's called the clinical study reports. So in the US, in law, FDA have been mandated to reduce all of the clinical study reports, but they're only doing that piece by piece. And until that's fully available, we won't be able to understand what the true benefits and harms are. And therefore, it's right for everybody at that point to ask questions. The second issue in the vaccine debate is going back to understanding and informing your benefits and harm, depending on your personal risk. Now, as I've said, it's much different for a child than it is somebody who's 85. So really, when I come to you, I'm not opposed to people making vaccines available, but what I am opposed to is not fundamentally informing your choice about what you do next. Therefore, if you're 55 and you're a triathlete, that's a very different decision to somebody with diabetes, hypertension, and has had a stroke about what might happen next. Therefore, we need a personalised approach to your risk. You can understand that, and then you can make an informed decision about what you do next. The problem is that doesn't exist. And in doing that, that's creating a lack of trust in society. The problem is that lack of trust then pervades to other areas, maybe evidence-based vaccines like the measles vaccine. We're seeing catastrophic drops in that. Same in the polio around the world. So you create a huge problem by not going. We're going to be honest and transparent about the evidence base. And that is a fundamental issue with the vaccines right now.
And one of the issues with all of that is also the way that when people ask questions or put alternative views forward, they're censored or taken down. And we know that the online safety bill is coming down the pipeline, and whether we challenge it or change it or not, this idea of causing some distress or legal but harmful. But even now, online, if you put things on social media, many people are taken off. Most recently, Dr. Tony Hinton came off Twitter, but we've seen it with a lot of well-known people in America and here. And you talked about the demonization of the president. To what extent, let's talk about the spirit of science firstly, about the whole idea that you should be able to debate everything and shine the light of reason on things, right? I mean, that is the idea about how science, you only get inquiry and understanding if you can explore and dissect ideas in the open, surely.
Well, first to say it's a fundamental human right that we have freedom of speech, and that shouldn't be contestable apart from some certain issues. But I think the way to look at it is what's happening with the online speech is this concept of misinformation. So, for instance, you gave me the address of where to come today. If you had given me the wrong address, that would have been misinformation, because it's an established fact. We're in this room and it's at this address in London. Now, if you'd have deliberately told me to go the wrong way because you wanted to delay me and make me not turn up today, that would have been disinformation. So I've been accused of both of those issues, misinformation and disinformation. And all we're trying to do is represent uncertainties. And the problem is what happens here is people's opinions become facts. And also what they'll do is turn to some bodies and they'll say, because the World Health Organization says this, it must be true. It must be fact. But this means that people ignore the fact that evidence for healthcare is often evolving. It changes as the evidence emerges. And actually, there are very few facts that actually you could sit down and say, this is information, and if you go against it, it's misinformation. And there are probably areas, so I'll give a good example. If somebody has a heart attack, then the vast majority, all doctors would say, giving you an aspirin is the right thing to do to reduce your risk of mortality, because that's based on over 200 randomized controlled trials. It's in national guidance, and all of the doctors will agree within guidance that's what we should do. So there's not just overwhelming opinion, there's overwhelming evidence, and it's high quality. And when you have all those things in place, you can say this is an established treatment that's based on high quality evidence backed by guidelines and is factual. Therefore, if I say don't do that, you would say that's misinformation. However, what we're talking about is issues where there's low quality evidence, people disagree, and therefore they're trying to represent the uncertainty. What people will do is say, I want to take that down because it's misinformation, because it disagrees with public health policy. And what they're using there is in the approach to break your human rights is that you are a threat to public safety.
Yeah.
And that's what they're saying at that moment in time. By trying to be honest and reflect the evidence, you are a threat to public safety. Now, that's happened to us twice. Despite the fact, for instance, when we wrote in The Spectator about masks, we were aware of what was happening with the Danish RCT, Dan Mask trial. Number two is I work with a guy called Tom Jefferson, who's done Cochrane systematic reviews for for about 2 decades now, and has done the non-pharmaceutical intervention review and has been working on that for the past 20 years. He's in contact with all the trialists. He's aware when they're being published. And he just updated that systematic review. And it comes to a very clear conclusion to say across the respiratory pathogens, and I'm aware of the update now, and in light of the DAMMAS trial, there's still significant uncertainty about the evidence. The question we had is, why in this country, with all of our research might and power, all of the research funding which is in excess of billions, have we not done one single trial, one single high-quality trial of masks? I cannot answer that, but to be honest with you, that is a complete failing to address the uncertainties, and it's unacceptable if you say you have an evidence-based approach.
So we just have to pause for a second and take that in, because the level of vitriol and people emotionally committing to an idea they have that people are being irresponsible or dangerous and cavalier and, putting everyone at risk by not wearing masks. There was a significant section of people that were all very vocal. And even now we see that there are serious discussion. I mean, obviously in some health sectors now, you have to wear masking according to the risk assessment. People are advocating that we have it on underground again. I've just come back from New York where they've consistently had it, and they were masking toddlers as well as a range of other things. I'm going to ask you the question, why is it that we've not had that test done here? And just in terms of doing these conversations without it becoming, yes, it is, no, it's not, finger pointing culture wars, but we've all got the same intention, surely, which is that we have health benefits and we have as least risk as possible and we mitigate it, right? So how are we best to do that and to engage with people who don't agree, but have got ideas perhaps not based on facts, but, on a number of ideas that have been put out there?
You make the main point. It's people's perception of the lack of equipoise. And equipoise means you think you're uncertain, you're in the middle, you don't know whether they work or not. Whereas once you suddenly make a very opinionated approach that this works, and you tend to rely on mechanisms then. You go back to, well, if you put something over your face, surely that blocks all of the pathogens and then we reduce the risk. That's the mechanism. And in doing that, you then say, well, I don't need to address it with an evidence-based approach. And we had a lot of this in the early 90s with surgery. There were surgeons who said, fundamentally, we don't need an evidence-based approach because we know what to do. However, what's happened is surgery has been dragged into an evidence-based world, and there's been significant numbers of studies that basically have shown that actually certain interventions have not shown to work. I'll give you a good example. They did a randomized controlled trial of knee arthroscopy when you go into a knee and you wash it out for arthritis. And in the control group, to make it as realistic as possible, they still put people to sleep. They put a little nick on the knee as though they had surgery, but they did nothing. And they randomized people to both those interventions. What did it show? It made no difference. And therefore, you will not get guidelines that say you can have knee arthroscopy washout for osteoarthritis anymore. We'll look for other things to do instead, like physiotherapy or whatever else is evidence-based. But you can see that problem. If you think you know what the right thing to do is, the difference in evidence-based approach would make you stand back and go, hold on a minute, what type of evidence would I like to inform my decision? Because if you go back to mechanisms, you can basically say anything works. 10 o'clock, shut the pubs, rule of 6, wear this. Why not gloves? Why are we not all wearing gloves, for instance? You could make anything. So you could keep going with your rules and regulations if you go back to mechanisms. To get with an equipoise, the government has to mandate our research institutes to address these uncertainties. And until it does this debate is going to go on and on. Luckily, we'll have a bit of a pause for about 6 or 8 weeks now because the summer holidays give us a natural social distancing break Watched everybody this morning taking off all over the world with their suitcases. But come September, as soon as the schools go back, the primary schools go back, we see a rise in pathogens. And this is all sorts of pathogens. There's about 30 viruses we know about that exist that we can test for in primary care that give rise to acute respiratory infections. Some give you colds, some make you a bit more unwell, some give you pneumonia. But all of that will increase the anxiety. And come this winter, there'll be people calling for restrictions again. It's very difficult because we don't want to get in arguments. But that's what will happen. And I keep sitting in the middle and keep getting asked back, what's your opinion? My opinion is to address the uncertainty with high quality evidence so that I and the listeners can make an informed choice about the decisions they make. I have no problem with the decisions you make so long as they are informed.
So one of the issues is, though, that in the last 3 decades or so, but perhaps for longer, the idea of judgment has come under attack, human judgment. They want to say the evidence says this. They want to say the facts say that, so do that. This idea that we have an intersection with that we make conscious decisions, it's very much the case, and I think this is particularly the case when it comes to the public. The idea is that the public is seen in a demonized way, in a way that's like mad, bad, and dangerous, that we're out of control. The history of policy, actually, the public health in the relationship to the public, in everything from the gin laws right the way through the Defence of the Realm Act, the whole idea of a healthy public or not, in terms of licensing and public action and interaction, has often been one that you've got this mad, potentially out of control group, and things have to be done and imposed, and that's carried on right through. And I'm very concerned, and I don't know how you could overcome it, except for have more conversations like this and actually to assert ourselves more in the public realm. But the idea that we can't trust the public to make decisions, judgments, and also that people politicians can be given an alternative view and to make decisions and make judgments on that basis. I mean, how do you? Because I get that you can keep calling for it, but there's also the thing that it's partly about how we see people, isn't it, and how they make decisions and whether you think they're worthy or not.
What you've just described to me feels like fundamentally anti-democratic. In effect, you say the public can't have wise decisions and can't have a skin in the game, if you like. They can't add their... Now, we can go to certain societies like China where they have this golden shield project where what happens is the internet, what goes out there is fundamentally policed. We're going to remove certain elements that we don't like. And I think that is scary. And I think there are elements of society who would like to go to that approach because they want their views to be dominant. It's incredibly important in this modern society that people find a voice. And in doing so, they find a voice through not just doing things like podcasts, communicating and writing their thoughts down. The key, though, is you've got to be careful that you don't become polarized, so you just start shouting at each other. And what we have to do is be more thoughtful about the issues in this debate. How do we present the issues that actually becomes clear there's a need for high quality evidence? What should we do in the face of that? What should politicians do and how should they represent us? Now, what happens is in places like Sweden, they've got much firmer laws that prevented the Coronavirus Act and saying we're going to throw everything out the window and we'll have a small cabinet office in 10 Downing Street who are having a party every evening and sat around a table like this and going, do we have a good idea about what we should do by the morning? Well, look, there's 6 of us around the table drinking here. Maybe we'll have a rule of 6 by tomorrow. That's exactly how it works.
It's funny how you put it.
But the reason you say it's funny because you can visualise that and see, in the light of day, if I was saying that 18 months ago, they'd have been taking me out and saying you need to be thrown out your job. But in the light of day, looking back, people can see how these decisions were put together and made. And we ask the questions. I go and ask questions with my colleagues. Where's the evidence to inform that? And we've looked at it. For instance, if you're going to interview in areas like schools with a mandate like masks, it is, to me, unethical if you don't have high quality evidence to inform that decision.
So what would be your message to whoever the potential leader is, and to government and the opposition, now, as we're going to be hitting, this is going to be hitting into the autumn. I mean, Together, we've got a campaign called "What's the Plan? Protect the Public." We've actually used we've used the images and the brand that they had both for hands and face for the cost of lockdown crisis, and for "What's the Plan?" We've used that one. They put on the lectern that everyone saw, very nudgy, but just to sort of make the point, what is the plan as we go into this next period? Where's the provision? Have you thought it through? But that's a campaign that we're asking all our members and supporters and the public to get involved and get outside our own echo chambers, to talk to colleagues and friends and to get them to lobby MPs and everything. But what would you say to them in terms of the approach that needs to be done day one? What do we need to do? What's your message, Dr. Carl Heneghan, to potential leader and to Conservative Party and to Labour, the opposition?
So I think when you look at the idea of a plan and you try and go in somewhere like the NHS, you just can't find the strategy and plan. It often goes on to hundreds of pages, multiple documents. I would distill it down, each area of the economy, society, into a one-pager. These are our priorities. This is what we need to deal with. And it should be reflected on what the public thinks the right thing to do. So you have to listen to the signals out there, not get into your ivory tower, get locked into your Westminster bubble and think, look, we have the right things to do because I'm surrounded by key opinion and advisors who often can't reflect the public. But I think if we distill that message down, we could see our priorities. And you could have a one-pager in healthcare, very straightforward. Issues like access, incredibly important. The public's telling you that. There are areas where the outcomes for you are highly deleterious and harmful, like cancer care. Why can't we have same-day access? If you've got cancer, I want you to be diagnosed, seen and treated within the week. That is possible, but we have to get rid of some of the low-value, non-evidence-based things. Stop wasting the 37 billion on test and trace that makes no difference and go, where's the evidence? How do we implement those issues? And I'll give you a good example of this. I just wrote recently about this. Paramedics, ambulances, it matters that they can get to you in what we call the golden hour. So if you're having a cardiac arrest, you drop down, I need to get a defibrillator. The survival rate is about 90% if I get to you in a minute. If it's 10 minutes, then basically it goes down to about 5%. That's why level 1 ambulances need to be there in 7 minutes. The same if you have a heart attack. We need to be within an hour. If I get to you within an hour, I'll save 32 lives for every 1,000 people I get to within that hour. Huge benefit to us as a society. But what do we see? Average waiting time for ambulances should be 15 minutes. They're 50 minutes. We can't get to these people because we're under-resourced. Now, we're talking about 3 or 4 ambulances in every area. We're talking about meeting those demand areas where it goes up. So we'll have to have some flex extra capacity. Now, we understand that in areas like business. So Tesco's and all the supermarkets at Christmas will flex for the extra demand. They understand when we're busy and how to have more people on the checkout. So I'm saying, pare this down to the evidence-based approach, get rid of all the low value where you tinker and interfere, and give us a one-pager on each area that actually says, here's our priorities and here's our policies.
Well, fantastic. I mean, it's very concerning that we could be in a Groundhog Day moment. And I don't want to be a catastrophist, and I don't want to say, oh, it's inevitable, this is going to happen. But the impulse of when in doubt, do something, when in doubt, restrict or legislate, along with a bit of an impulse that's happened where we've seen it with the weather reports, right? Where people have sort of not come to the office or they've closed schools. I mean, it's really shocking that we've set ourselves up on a certain trajectory. So I think even more so, that's the need for evidence-based approach and to distill things down and be very clear. I mean, we're certainly at Together going to encourage people to be vocal about this. As we reach towards this next bit, I mean, if you're, ordinary person, they're not a doctor or they're not a politician, what would you say to people what they can do and have their voices heard?
So I think people talk about the precautionary approach, don't they? I think we live in a world which is the cautionary approach. And I'll just give you an example of how this works. So when I have trainees with me and we see very elderly people or young people and they're very unwell, their cautionary approach is to say, we're going to admit them all. And that means they're safe, There'll be no problems. But actually what they're going to do is completely overwhelm the system. And my job is to help them make better reasoned decisions, tolerate uncertainty, and be able to reflect with experience. And actually you go, actually knowing when to intervene is just as important as knowing when not to intervene. When can you wait a little, pause, reflect, and become more analytical? Now, what's happening in this modern era is it's forcing us to have instantaneous judgments, and most of them, because of our lack of experience, our inability to tolerate uncertainty, means we're going to be cautionary in our approach. And yet, I was brought up in an era in 1976 when we were thrown out the door in the middle of the heat wave. Yes, I got sunburnt. Yes, we were out there. But actually, we were out enjoying ourselves and having a great time. In this modern era, I am concerned about the approach where everything is a catastrophe. And it seems the big problem is we perpetuate that because somehow we will click on the headline, the numbers go up, and we perpetuate this cycle of catastrophizing headline. So here's what I do. Next time you see one of them, skim across it, move to another headline, and if we stop reading it, then it'll stop being the predominant approach in the media.
It's great. I mean, I was there at the time as I was very young, but I remember the advice was don't hose the garden and use your water again. And actually the big discussion at the time was global cooling. In the 70s, the big discussion was global cooling. And it was a catastrophe that could be heading towards us, but not talked about in those terms as much. A couple of final points. One thing that's come up that I often have people post in the comments, and just to hear what you think about this. The do not resuscitate and the remdesivir, I can never pronounce the name properly, but those, the allocation of that medicine, some people seem to think that that was just done ad hoc everywhere. I mean, what's your thoughts on it and what's the situation with that?
Well, the area I can talk about is in care homes. Yeah. And I think, that's about a third of all the deaths were, and at one point it was about half. So a huge problem. Yeah. We haven't invested, but we won't go there. That was a huge problem. But the concept is these people often are unwell. That's why they're in care homes. And many of them do have do not resuscitate orders. Many of them have orders like they don't want to go in hospital. And actually will actively, even though I say it's in your best interest, they will not. But there are certain times you do go in and the key is, can you create a significant benefit for the individual? So for instance, if they have a fractured neck of femur, then going to a trauma unit is the appropriate place because they can fix it, get them back. And it's about quality of life decision making. That's the key in that area. It's not about quantity of life, it's about quality, making sure you get the best choices for individuals. The bit I'm more worried about is what I call, and I think this is a policy I would like to enact, it's called having a named advocate. So if you're in a care home, normally what happens is, if your mother was in there, you may pop in there on a daily basis. You check her over. You make sure she drinks, eats. Gives us a ring and says, just been in the ward. She's noticed, actually, my mum's got a red leg. Calls the GP. She's got cellulitis. We can sort it really quickly. What happened in the pandemic? We got all rid of all of that. We confined people to their homes. And when you're elderly and you're confused, if you get a little bit of infection, you stop drinking, you stop eating, and with days you can die of dehydration. It's a real problem when you're older. So my answer is to say that everybody should have a single person, irrespective of pandemic, what's going on, who can go into an arena and make sure that person is all right, can make sure they're eating, drinking. If they have something else going on, they can point it out. And I think that would have a huge impact and would have changed the course of some of the outcomes in care homes. And therefore, and you can go into hospitals just the same, and you can say, I'm not happy with this care for my mum. And that person is an advocate and represents individuals when they're vulnerable, their best interests. And that would get rid of a lot of the problems for these care homes and address this DNR issue to say, is it appropriate in this situation? You are the advocate, you help this person make that decision.
Well, we've covered a lot, and I'm very much looking forward to hearing more from you as we go through the future, because many of us think that because of these trends and because of where we've got to, there's going to be a continuation. But Dr. Carl Heneghan, thank you so much for coming in to speak to us today at Together Talks podcast.
You're welcome.
And you can join Together Declaration as a member, which helps us campaign around all these issues. We've got the cost of lockdown, cost of living crisis. We've also got the challenge. What's the plan, as we were talking about today, about what's going to be happening with the NHS. We think the public having its voices heard with MPs, with councillors, with trusts, with local organisations up and down the country, having our voices heard is really important and essential. We've shown that that can have an impact with vaccine mandates and passports. We need to keep doing that, and being a member helps with that. Please go and get some friends to listen to this, share it, engage with it, post it, and remember that we're always better together, we're stronger together, and we can make the world as we see fit together.